The story of German women prisoners stunned by American women in industry is not simply one of cultural shock. It is a lens into the larger forces that shaped the Second World War. These women have been raised in a society where female identity was tied to motherhood, domesticity, and quiet obedience. Under the Third Reich, strength was measured in terms of soldiers, weapons, and rigid discipline. Yet behind the barbed wire of American POW camps, they encountered a truth that challenged every part of that worldview. What they saw in America was not weakness, but a different kind of strength. Factories filled with women welding planes and riveting ships revealed a society capable of mobilizing its entire population for victory. The sight of women treated as equals in the workplace, respected for their skill and productivity, contradicted everything they had been told about gender, about freedom, and about democracy. It was not just America's tanks, bombers, or endless supplies of food that impressed them. It was the spirit of participation, the idea that every citizen, male or female, had a role to play in the nation's destiny. For many POW women, the experience planted seeds of doubt about the propaganda they had once believed. If their leaders had lied about America, what else had they lied about? If women here could work alongside men with pride and independence, what might women in Germany have achieved had they been given the same opportunity? These questions lingered, quietly reshaping minds, even within the confines of captivity. In the years after the war, stories of America's industrial women spread slowly across Europe. Some POWs recounted them to friends and families back home. Others carried them silently, memories too painful or too humbling to share openly. Yet the image endured, women in overalls, sparks flying, assembling the war machines that had toppled the Reich. For history, the lesson is clear. America's victory was not only a triumph of weapons and strategy. It was also a triumph of values. By opening its factories to women, the United States tapped into a reservoir of strength that Nazi Germany had ignored. In doing so, it not only won a war, but helped redefine what women could be. The German women POWs entered camps expecting cruelty, but left with memories of abundance, fairness, and a vision of women's strength unlike anything they had known. And in their stunned silence lay an unspoken truth. The world they had left behind was gone, and a new world, one shaped by freedom, equality, and opportunity, was already being built. Summer 1944. The defining moment came not from rumor, nor from secondhand glimpses, but from direct experience. In late July, a small group of German women POWs, nurses, auxiliaries, and camp staff were escorted under guard near an American industrial facility during a routine transfer. What they saw that day shattered the last fragments of the worldview they had carried with them from Germany. Through the tall fences and open gates, they saw an aircraft plant in full motion. The roar of machinery filled the air, punctuated by the sharp clang of metal and the crackle of welding torches. Thousands of workers, men and women alike, filled the vast space. Sparks flew from rivet guns as massive bomber fuselages rolled slowly down assembly lines. The smell of oil and steel mixed with the scent of fresh paint. But it was not the machinery that silenced them. It was the women. They saw women in overalls and protective goggles, hoisting heavy tools, climbing scaffolds, and welding seams along the wings of planes. Women with bandanas tied around their hair worked side by side with men, joking, shouting orders, and keeping the lines moving at a relentless pace. Entire sections of the plant were staffed almost entirely by women. Welders, mechanics, inspectors, truck drivers hauling crates of parts. The German POW women froze. Some whispered, "It's not possible." Others simply stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. In Germany, women had been told their place was in the home, or at best, in supporting roles. Here, women were not only participants, they were driving the very heart of the war effort. The realization struck with brutal clarity. If America could unleash such power by mobilizing both its men and its women, then Germany's fate had already been sealed. No matter how disciplined its soldiers, no matter how fierce its ideology, The Reich could not compete against a nation where even the supposedly weaker sex wielded the tools of war. One POW nurse later recalled, "We had believed the Americans decadent, their women soft, yet there we saw them welding the machines that were destroying our cities." In that moment, I knew the war was lost. For some, the scene brought humiliation. They thought of their mothers back home, scrounging for scraps amid bombed-out ruins, while American women lived in abundance and pride. For others, there was awe. They could not help but admire the determination in those women's faces, the energy of their movements, the confidence in their voices. It was a strength they had never been permitted to imagine for themselves. The guards escorting them seemed to sense their astonishment. One American sergeant remarked with a grin, "That's Winnie the Welder for you. She works as hard as any man." The phrase meant little at the time, but the image etched itself into their memories. Women as the equals of men, women as builders of empires. This was the breaking point, the moment when disbelief gave way to reluctant understanding. The German women POWs realized they were not simply prisoners of war. They were witnesses to a new world order. And in that order, America's strength lay not only in its weapons, but in its people, united across gender lines in a way Germany had never allowed. In silence, they returned to camp, carrying with them a vision that would haunt their thoughts long after the war. The sparks of that factory were more than flashes of welding steel. They were sparks of truth, igniting the knowledge that Germany could never match what they had just seen. As weeks turned into months, the shock experienced by German women POWs deepened into something more complex. What had begun as fleeting moments of surprise, seeing women in overalls, driving trucks, or guarding posts, soon transformed into a steady stream of revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about America, about war, and about themselves. The consequences of these realizations went far beyond curiosity. For women who had been raised in Nazi Germany, witnessing the industrial strength of American women sparked uncomfortable questions about the very foundations of the Reich. In the camps, conversations often drifted back to what they had seen or heard. At first, there were denials. It must only be temporary until the men return. But as stories of American women's achievements spread, denial gave way to uneasy acknowledgement. Guards eager to show pride in their nation sometimes told POWs about their wives or sisters working in shipyards and factories. Local newspapers occasionally passed around the camps carried photographs of smiling women at assembly lines. The POW women, many of them nurses or auxiliaries, were not unfamiliar with hard work. They had labored in hospitals near the front, staff communications units, or endured the hardships of retreat. But there was a difference. In Germany, their work was always presented as secondary, as an extension of men's duties. In America, women's labor was celebrated as vital, equal, even heroic. Testimonies written years later speak of German nurses who were quietly humbled by this revelation. One wrote, "We were taught that the Americans were weak and divided, but here even the women are soldiers of labor." This we could not understand. Another POW recalled how she had once laughed at the idea of a woman building a bomber, but after seeing photographs of assembly lines, she admitted they had proven us wrong. This was not only about gender. It was about power. America's ability to mobilize its women explained much of what German POWs had already experienced firsthand. The endless supplies, the overwhelming firepower, the constant flow of food and clothing in the camps. They began to realize that the abundance surrounding them was not a trick of propaganda, but the result of a society that drew strength from every hand willing to work. For some, this realization bred resentment. It was painful to admit that their own homeland had hobbled itself by clinging to outdated roles. While their brothers, fathers, and husbands were dying on the Eastern Front, or in Italy, German women had been told to stay home and produce children. Meanwhile, American women were producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft that were deciding the war. The whispers of doubt grew louder. POW diaries revealed that many German women began to privately question Nazi ideology. They asked themselves why their government had ignored half the population in its desperate struggle. They wondered what might have been different if German women had been encouraged to take up welding torches and rivet guns instead of knitting needles. The impact of these observations went even further. When German women, POWs, eventually returned home after the war, they carried these memories with them. For some, it shaped their view of the post-war world. They returned to a Germany devastated, its cities in ruins, its men dead or broken, its ideology discredited. And in that landscape, the stories of American women working alongside men became a quiet but powerful comparison. A nurse who had spent 3 years in an American camp later admitted to her children, "The Americans were strong because their women were not hidden. They stood beside their men, and this is why they won." In post-war Germany, where Reconstruction demanded every available worker, such lessons took root, even if silently. For others, the memories brought bitterness. Some POWs resented the idea that women could step outside traditional roles. They clung to the old ideals, insisting that America's way was not for them. But even these women could not erase the shock they had felt at the sight of women in overalls working lathes and forges. The memory lingered, a contradiction they could never fully resolve. And yet, amid all these personal reckonings, one truth stood above the rest. America's victory was not only forged on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. The POW women understood this more keenly than most because they had lived under a system that deliberately excluded women from such roles. By comparing the two, they could see clearly where Germany had failed. The war had shown them the price of ideology. Where Nazi leaders preached purity and tradition, America practiced pragmatism and inclusion. Where Germany relied on conquest and coercion, America relied on mobilization and production. The result was evident in every plane overhead, every ration box in camp, every convoy rolling across Europe. By 1945, as Germany collapsed, the contrast could not have been sharper. America stood as a nation where women had risen to the challenge, where their labor had been decisive, where their contribution was undeniable. For the German women who had witnessed it, this truth became the most lasting consequence of their captivity. It was not just that they had been shocked by women in industry. It was that this shock had revealed the deeper reality of American power and the fatal weakness of their own homeland. If the first glimpses of American women in uniform unsettled the German POWs, what followed pushed them into outright disbelief. As their captivity stretched from weeks into months, more details of American life reached their ears, and with each revelation, the picture of a very different nation came into focus. By 1943 and 1944, the American home front had transformed into something unprecedented. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, millions of men had been called to arms. To fill the void they left behind in factories, shipyards, and fields, American women stepped forward in staggering numbers. By war's end, over 5.8 million women had entered industry, building planes, tanks, ships, and weapons at a pace no enemy could match. The German women prisoners heard about this through camp chatter, guard conversations, and the occasional glimpse beyond the fences. Some camps organized work details where prisoners under supervision were taken to local farms or warehouses. It was there that German women first saw what they had only half believed in rumor. American women in overalls driving tractors, loading trucks, and managing ledgers. To the POWs, the sight was like stepping into another world. In Germany, women had been kept firmly in the domestic sphere. Nazi propaganda glorified the slogan Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church as the only true calling of womanhood. While Germany reluctantly called women into auxiliary roles, operating anti-aircraft batteries, serving in communications, or working as nurses, it never envisioned them as equals in industry. Even when German factories desperately needed labor, the regime preferred to exploit forced foreign workers rather than mobilize its own women. The Americans had taken the opposite path. The propaganda posters plastered across towns told the story. Wendy the welder flexing her arm, women in bandanas and goggles grinning beside machines, proud slogans declaring, "The more women at work, the sooner we'll win." These were not hidden contributions. They were celebrated, broadcast, and normalized. Imagine the astonishment of a German nurse POW when she saw a poster outside a supply depot depicting a young woman wielding a rivet gun, her face determined, her stance commanding. It was the exact opposite of the Nazi ideal, where women were soft, maternal, and deferential. Here was an image of strength and independence, qualities that in Germany were reserved only for men. Inside the camps, whispers grew into debates. Some POW women scoffed, dismissing what they saw as propaganda tricks. No woman could do a man's work, they muttered, repeating what they had been taught. Others, however, could not deny what was right before their eyes. They saw sparks fly from factory windows at night, long columns of women workers walking home in groups, and rows of trucks driven by women along American highways. The reality was undeniable for many. The statistics, when they finally learned them, were almost incomprehensible. By 1944, American women were producing half of all munitions, nearly a third of aircraft, and thousands of tanks and ships. Entire shipyards were staffed largely by women who worked 10-hour shifts and still managed households afterward. While German women were encouraged to knit socks for soldiers, American women were building the very bombers that darkened German skies. The cultural clash was profound. One POW reportedly asked the guard in disbelief, "You allow your wife to work among men, and you are not ashamed?" The guard laughed and replied proudly that his wife was an aircraft mechanic making more money than she ever had before, and that she was just as vital to the war effort as he was. To a German prisoner raised on strict hierarchies, the idea that a man would take pride in his wife working alongside other men was almost unthinkable. Some POW women even experienced moments of quiet admiration. Diaries and post-war memoirs tell of German nurses who admitted being impressed by the confidence and competence of American women. They marveled that these women spoke freely with men, exchanged jokes with guards, and displayed a kind of independence they had never been permitted. But admiration often came with unease. If America had tapped into the labor of both its men and women, what did that mean for the balance of the war? The German Reich, for all its bluster, was strangling under labor shortages. By 1944, factories begged for workers even as women were told their highest duty was motherhood. America, meanwhile, had doubled its strength by throwing open the gates of industry to women. This realization bred a creeping sense of dread around campfires and bunk beds. German POW women discussed the obvious conclusion: Germany could never compete on equal terms. The shock was not just about gender roles. It was about survival. A nation that mobilized every citizen, male or female, would inevitably outproduce and outlast one that clung to rigid ideology. By late 1944, this truth was unavoidable. Reports filtered in of B-24 Liberators and B-25 Mitchells raining destruction over German cities. Thousands of bombers, more than Germany could ever hope to match. The POW women began to connect the dots. Those gleaming bombers had not just been built by American men. They were the work of millions of American women, too. It was this connection, dawning slowly and then all at once, that delivered the greatest shock of captivity. America's strength lay not only in its soldiers, but in its women. The story of German women POWs in America begins with the moment of capture. Most of them were not soldiers in the strictest sense, but served on the margins of war. Nurses tending to wounded soldiers, auxiliaries assigned to Luftwaffe bases, or staff workers caught in the chaos of retreat. When German lines collapsed in North Africa, Italy, and later France, thousands of men fell into Allied hands. Among them were women swept along in surrender. For them, the shame was double. In the worldview of the Reich, to be captured was dishonor enough. But for women whose role was supposedly to uphold strength and morality at home, the stigma was even heavier. Their first thoughts were filled with dread. Nazi propaganda had taught them that Americans were crude and merciless, lacking culture, decency, or restraint. Tales of abuse were whispered to stiffen German resistance. For the women boarding transports bound for the United States, the fear was visceral. What would happen in enemy hands? The journey across the Atlantic was long, cramped, and filled with uncertainty. Some prisoners clung to one another, murmuring prayers. Others speculated about the conditions awaiting them. Rumors spread. Would they be used as slave labor? Would food be withheld? No one could imagine that across the ocean lay barracks lined with clean beds, stocked pantries, and guards who would treat them with respect. Their first days in American camps overturned every expectation. As they marched past barbed wire fences and guard towers, they braced for harshness. Instead, they were assigned to neat wooden barracks, each with mattresses, blankets, and functioning stoves for heat. The air smelled not of filth, but of soap and disinfectant. For women accustomed to the rubble of bombed-out cities back home, the order and tidiness were jarring. Then came the meals. Many had endured shortages in Germany long before their capture. By 1944, the civilian population was scraping by on thin rations, substituting barley for coffee and stretching bread with fillers. Butter, fruit, and fresh meat were luxuries reserved for the well-connected. But in America, even prisoners received balanced meals. White bread, potatoes, beans, eggs, and sometimes even fruit or dessert. Testimonies recall the disbelief on their faces as steaming plates of food were carried in. Some hesitated, thinking a cruel trick. Others whispered, "This is better than we had at home." For women who had expected humiliation, the offering of food felt like an unspoken acknowledgement of their humanity. The first signs of cultural shock appeared quickly. They noticed women among their guards and staff. American nurses, clerks, even drivers wearing military uniforms. The sight was disorienting. In Germany, female uniforms existed, but were strictly limited and never in positions of authority over men. Yet here were American women, issuing orders with calm authority, their presence treated as entirely normal. The whispers among the POWs grew. If women here could work in uniform, what else could they do? Rumors filtered through the camp fences. Some guards mentioned relatives working in factories. Others spoke proudly of wives who riveted airplane frames or stitched parachutes for soldiers overseas. For the German women, these stories sounded like fantasy. The Reich had never mobilized its women this way, except under extreme duress in the final months of the war. To them, factories were a man's domain, and the idea of women operating machinery, welding steel, or running lathes seemed absurd. And yet the hints kept coming. They saw posters tacked on notice boards. "We can do it," with a strong-armed woman in a bandana. They glimpsed supply crates labeled from cities where women made up half the workforce. It was here in these subtle, early signs that the first cracks appeared in their worldview. The shock was not yet complete, but it had begun. For the first time, German women POWs confronted a contradiction they could not ignore. The Americans, portrayed as decadent and weak, had organized their society in ways Germany had not dared, and it seemed to be working. To understand the astonishment of German women POWs in America, we must first step back into the world they came from. In Hitler's Germany, a woman's role was strictly defined. The Nazi regime celebrated motherhood, obedience, and domesticity above all else. Women were expected to raise children, support their husbands, and dedicate themselves to the family unit summed up in the infamous slogan, Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. While some women did serve in the German Red Cross, the Luftwaffe auxiliaries, or as nurses near the front, their participation was always framed as supportive. Industrial work, mechanical labor, and anything resembling equality with men in the workplace was discouraged, even ridiculed. Germany believed its strength lay in men on the battlefield and women in the home. Now, contrast this with America after Pearl Harbor. In December 1941, when the United States entered the war, the nation mobilized with unprecedented speed. Factories that once built cars began producing tanks and airplanes. Shipyards expanded, assembly lines multiplied, and weapons poured out by the millions. But there was one key difference that shocked outsiders. America opened its factories to women. By 1945, more than 5.8 million American women had taken up jobs in industry, earning the nickname Winnie the Welder. They welded steel, riveted bomber fuselages, stitched parachutes, and worked heavy machinery once thought beyond their capability. Posters declared, "We can do it," and across the country, women proved they could. 4 German women captured and transported to POW camps in the United States. This reality clashed violently with everything they had been told. They had expected cruelty from their captors. Instead, they encountered not only humane treatment, but glimpses of a society where women moved with confidence and purpose, side by side with men. The question arose, what did this mean for Germany's future if America could harness the strength of its women as well as its men? Gates creaked open and a small group of German women shuffled forward, their eyes downcast, shoulders tense. They were prisoners now, captured far from their homeland, carried across the Atlantic and deposited on American soil. Fear weighed heavily on them. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for what they thought awaited in the United States. Cruelty, humiliation, perhaps even starvation. The enemy, they had been told, was barbaric and godless. But as they passed the perimeter fence, a strange sight caught their eyes. Beyond the camp, the skyline was dotted with smokestacks and factory roofs. And on one supervised work detail, they saw something that left them momentarily speechless. Rows of American women dressed in overalls, bandanas tied around their hair, stood shoulder to shoulder with men. Sparks flew as they welded, riveted, and hammered. Giant machines roared as airplanes and trucks took shape. Women drove forklifts, carried crates, and worked machinery that in Germany had been reserved for men alone. One German nurse whispered, almost in disbelief, "Das ist nicht möglich, it's not possible." For these women raised in a society that confined females to the home, this moment was not just a surprise. It was a shattering of everything they thought they knew. Here was a nation where women didn't merely keep households running. They built weapons, fed armies, and fueled an industrial engine that dwarfed anything in Europe. The central question loomed large. How could America, a land they had been told was weak and decadent, trust women with such responsibility and thrive because of it? This was the beginning of their shock, a moment that would force them to rethink both their enemy and the very foundations of the world they came from. The lesson was not lost on those who paid attention. By 1945, the evidence was overwhelming. American women hadn't just filled gaps left by men. They had become essential cogs in the greatest industrial mobilization in history. The statistics were staggering. Over 5.8 million women in factories and shipyards. Production numbers that exceeded Axis capabilities combined. A society that had tapped into its full human potential while Germany clung to outdated ideology. 4 German women POWs. This realization was both humbling and terrifying. They had believed their nation invincible, their ideology superior. Yet here they stood, witnesses to a different kind of strength, one that didn't demand rigid conformity but encouraged participation, didn't enforce hierarchy but celebrated contribution. The final irony was not lost on them. While Nazi leaders preached about racial superiority and national destiny, they had ignored half their population. America, supposedly weak and divided, had united its people, men and women, different races working side by side, and in doing so, had forged a power Germany could never match. The German women POWs who witnessed American industrial might carry those memories forever. Many returned to a shattered homeland with new understanding. Victory had not been decided only by tanks and bombers, but by values. By societies willing to mobilize everyone, by nations confident enough to trust women with responsibility, by democracies that saw strength in inclusion rather than exclusion. Some carried bitterness, clinging to old beliefs. Others carried hope, believing Germany could rebuild differently. But all carried the knowledge that they had witnessed something remarkable. A nation where women in coveralls and bandanas had helped decide history's greatest war. That image, sparks flying from welding torches, women working alongside men, building machines that brought down empires, would never leave them. It was proof that power came not only from force, but from freedom. Not only from discipline, but from dignity. Not only from might, but from mobilization of all citizens regardless of gender. The story of German women POWs and their astonishment at American women in industry is more than a historical footnote. It is a lens into World War II's deeper truths. That victory belonged to nations willing to adapt, to societies confident enough to challenge tradition, to people who understood that strength comes in many forms. For the German women who experienced this transformation firsthand, captivity became education. They had entered camps as true believers in Nazi ideology. Many left questioning everything they had been taught. They had expected to find weakness in America. Instead, they found a different kind of power, one rooted not in conquest, but in cooperation. Not in subjugation, but in opportunity. The lasting impact of these experiences rippled through post-war Germany. When these women returned home, they brought stories of what they had witnessed. Some shared them openly, influencing family and friends. Others kept them private, quiet knowledge that shaped personal choices. But collectively, their experiences contributed to Germany's post-war transformation. The new Germany that emerged from ruins would be different from the Reich. It would be a democracy where women could work, vote, participate fully in society, where rigid hierarchies gave way to more fluid structures, where ideology took back seat to pragmatism. The seeds of that transformation were planted in many places, but some were planted in the minds of German women POWs who had witnessed American women building bombers in Indiana factories, driving trucks in Texas, working lathes in Michigan. They had seen the future, and it worked. Today, the lesson remains relevant. Nations that mobilize their full populations, regardless of gender, race, background, possess strength that rigid, hierarchical societies can never match. America's victory in World War II was military, economic, technological, but it was also social and cultural. By opening factories to women, by trusting them with responsibility, by celebrating their contributions, America demonstrated that democracy wasn't weakness, it was strength. 4 German women, POWs, stunned by what they witnessed. This truth became undeniable. And in their silent acknowledgement lay one of World War II's most powerful but overlooked stories. That wars are won not only by soldiers, but by societies. Not only by weapons, but by values. Not only by force, but by freedom. The German women POWs entered camps expecting cruelty, but left with memories of abundance, fairness, and a vision of women's strength unlike anything they had known. In their stunned silence lay an unspoken truth. The world they had left behind was gone, and a new world, one shaped by freedom, equality, and opportunity, was already being built. For history, the lesson is clear. America's victory was not only a triumph of weapons and strategy. It was also a triumph of values. By opening its factories to women, the United States tapped into a reservoir of strength that Nazi Germany had ignored. In doing so, it not only won a war, but helped redefine what women could be. The story of German women prisoners stunned by American women in industry is not simply one of cultural shock. It is a lens into the larger forces that shaped the Second World War. These women have been raised in a society where female identity was tied to motherhood, domesticity, and quiet obedience. Under the Third Reich, strength was measured in terms of soldiers, weapons, and rigid discipline. Yet behind the barbed wire of American POW camps, they encountered a truth that challenged every part of that worldview. What they saw in America was not weakness, but a different kind of strength. Factories filled with women welding planes and riveting ships revealed a society capable of mobilizing its entire population for victory. The sight of women treated as equals in the workplace, respected for their skill and productivity, contradicted everything they had been told about gender, about freedom, and about democracy. It was not just America's tanks, bombers, or endless supplies of food that impressed them. It was the spirit of participation, the idea that every citizen, male or female, had a role to play in the nation's destiny. And in that recognition lay the ultimate lesson of World War II, that the greatest power comes not from controlling people, but from freeing them, not from limiting potential, but from unleashing it, not from division, but from unity. This was the truth that German women, POWs, carried home, and it changed everything.